have a bunch of notes that I'll just I'll reference tonight as we talk about the Western Shoshone struggle for sovereignty. Because the Western Shoshone struggle for sovereignty applies itself, if I'm familiar from what I've read and from what I've heard from Chris, with your organization or your union here, pretty closely, because the Western Shoshone story is the story of the struggle of an indigenous population against capitalism in its rawest and most vicious form. And I say that not to be flippant or dramatic, but rather to say when money becomes more important than human life and when profit becomes more important than the survival of a people, whether that is a people by and large or a people, meaning a family even, we have, there aren't words dramatic enough, so I'll just say a crisis of unparalleled proportions. And that's what the Western Shoshone situation has been since 1863. So in 1863, there was a treaty called the Treaty of Ruby Valley, which was signed between the Western Shoshone Nation and the United States government. What had been happening was that white settlers who were trying to get from the east to California to gold fields after gold was discovered were finding that they were being, in their terms, harassed or bothered by natives as they crossed through Nevada. I mean, realistically, they were just probably scared of non-whites, and they needed some sense of solace as they passed through to their potential riches that would allow them safe passage. So a treaty was signed called the Treaty of Ruby Valley. It was signed between the Shoshones and the United States government. This is an awesome dance party experience that's going on. So anyway, the Treaty of Ruby Valley did a couple things. It offered safe passage, the Shoshones offered safe passage to white settlers passing through traditional Shoshone lands. What it did not do, or it also actually gave permission to the government to put Shoshones on reservations, or not on reservations, but on reservations. I can check the actual wording of it. And it also gave the United States government mining rights, and that's important. We'll get into that a little bit later. What the Treaty of Ruby Valley did not do, it did not cede, sell, or give away any land to the United States government, and that's critical for the next, until today, updates of the situation. Because there were a lot of treaties signed over the course of history that did give away land to the United States government, or did sell land. But the Shoshones are relatively unique in that they never gave away their land. The Treaty of Ruby Valley doesn't allow for that. So that's a really important consideration. So, unfortunately, gold being discovered in that passageway, and gold being discovered throughout Nevada, created a situation where an encroachment started throughout the United States on Shoshone land by folks interested in the potential for gold and riches in Shoshone territory. So what started happening was a conflict between the Shoshones and the United States government and mining interests over the land itself. Okay? And what came to pass was the Shoshones quickly realizing that they were going to lose a battle based on a treaty that they had signed that never gave away land, because the assumption by the United States government was that the land had been given away. So as early as 1932, the Shoshones got legal counsel to represent them in what became a long and protracted argument with the United States government, battle with the United States government. But it's okay, it happens. It happens. About the ownership of the land. And the government did something pretty ingenious. They created something called the Indian Claims Commission. And the Indian Claims Commission was a mechanism by which the government could interface with indigenous populations to cover land dispute issues. And the reason it was so nefarious is because the government's way of dealing with issues in terms of its legality and its framework and the indigenous approach of dealing with things didn't match. It was literally just like apples and oranges. I mean, the Shoshones weren't quick to say, okay, court battle. They dealt with things differently. And the government was quick to say, legal battle, lawsuit. And it was just two opposite worlds colliding. So the Indian Claims Commission was supposed to be a common ground where they could come together, but it wasn't a common ground. The Indian Claims Commission, basically set up by the government, said, okay, native tribes, native nations, you can send your representatives to argue on your behalf, but the Indian Claims Commission and the government determined who those representatives were. So they had established a situation where representatives or natives who were working with or conciliatory, is that the right word, to a government position, were then arguing on the Shoshone's behalf. And you can imagine where this is going to go. You know, the government will be able to railroad or ram the whole thing through. So, what happened was that the Indian Claims Commission was successful in getting the Shoshone position squashed, and it looked like what was going to happen was the government was going to be able to claim that the lands were actually taken. And what the government did in the early 1950s was persuade some Shoshones to file for compensation for these lands, meaning the Indian Claims Commission representatives were told that if you file for compensation for the lands that were taken 100 years ago, or in the 1800s, then you will be paid off for these lands, and this whole situation will be done. And the Indian Claims Commission representatives started to push this idea through. The problem is that no lands had been sold, so there was no payment to be made. And the whole idea behind this, the government realized that the Treaty of Ruby Valley hadn't gotten them anything in terms of the land that they wanted. So if they were able to pay for this land, then there was a sale, there was a transaction, and something had been sold, and the Shoshones would be out of luck. Historically, without any change of position, Duckwater, Timbisha, Yamba, and the Dan traditional family, four groups within the Shoshones, all have categorically, historically said they never had any representation on the Indian Claims Commission. So the Indian Claims Commission was representing somebody, but it wasn't representing the largest and most significant of the Shoshone groups. So in 1962, the Indian Claims Commission stated that the Western Shoshone Nation had been deprived of its land by gradual encroachment, and that the process of gradual encroachment on Shoshone land led to a point where the Shoshones lost their land, and they chose an arbitrary date of July 1st, 1872, I think, as the date that encroachment happened. So you can see where this is going, because what they did is the Indian Claims Commission and the government valued the Shoshone land on the date of that gradual encroachment. I don't know how you figure out in a piece of land the size of Nevada that enough white dudes have come in to make it Whiteville on July 1st, 1872, and therefore price the land and value it accordingly. I don't know how that makes sense, right? But that's what they did. So it's now the 1960s, and this land is being valued at 1872 prices, and more significantly, the government is claiming that the land at that point was sold. That based on the valuation of the land at that time, that the land was sold. And they awarded the Shoshones, the government in all its good graces, awarded the Shoshones $27 million, which is the amount, or the value of the land in 1872, not including interest, which is ridiculous. So the Indian Claims Commission continued on in this struggle. Of course, there was a huge number of Shoshones who were desperately unhappy about the situation until 1979, when the Indian Claims Commission gave a final judgment that this was a settlement, that there had been a taking of the land or a transfer of the land in 1872, and that this $27 million stood. So what is significant about this moment in history is that as of 1979, that money hadn't been paid to any Shoshone people. It's pretty critical to remember as we go on. There was no Shoshones walking around. It wasn't like 27 Shoshones pocketed $1 million each, or 1 million Shoshones pocketed $27 each. This money was just somewhere, but it had been a sale. And if this is not making sense to you, you're right on target, because it doesn't make any sense. A simultaneous case was going on. Two elderly Shoshone sisters, Carrie and Mary Dan, who were cattle ranchers, and were grazing cattle on their land in Crescent Valley, Nevada. And according to them, they've been living on this land since time immemorial, but I mean legally, quote unquote, it had been homesteaded, I can't remember, maybe 100 years before or something like that by their grandfather. The government sued the Dan sisters for overgrazing, overgrazing their cattle. And the idea was that because the Dan sisters were grazing cattle on land technically now that was the government's land, that the Dan sisters were illegally grazing their own cattle on land that didn't belong to them, and essentially that they were overgrazing and also trespassing. Okay, so the Dans decided to fight this, and they took it all the way to the Supreme Court, this issue. Their case was that the Western Shoshone Nation has sovereignty over this land. And the Dans and the Shoshones in general have never claimed that they want to own the land, they don't want to develop the land in the traditional Western sense. What they want to do is be caretakers of the land. That's all they've ever wanted, is to be caretakers. And the government's case was that, this is where this starts to get twisted and sick. The government's case was that the Western Shoshone Aboriginal claim to the land had been extinguished when the Indian Claims Commission set that 1872 benchmark. At that point, according to the government, it was a done deal because the land valuation had been set on behalf of the Shoshone, and this $27 million existed in an account somewhere for the Shoshone, and therefore the Shoshone had sold their land, case closed. Well, even though that was the government's position, in 1983, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals reversed a position and said, no, this doesn't fly because no money has been paid to the Western Shoshone, right? Okay, so, like I said, this went all the way to the Supreme Court, and in a display of legalese and true-life craziness, the Supreme Court heard the case, which is an amazing thing, but they didn't hear the case on the grounds of ownership, which is what you'd think. You'd think that the Supreme Court would hear the case to decide who owns the land. But that's a deadly situation. The Supreme Court, I mean, they're not fools. They're not, it's not the Supreme Court working for natives necessarily. So what would have happened if the Supreme Court had decided an ownership situation? What happens if the Supreme Court had decided that the Shoshones actually owned this parcel of land? Well, that's a bad situation for a lot of people who own a lot of land, quote unquote, on traditional Aboriginal area, on traditional Aboriginal property. Because if you say to the Shoshones, hey, guess what? You do own most of Nevada, edging into Death Valley and also into Utah, then what happens to all the other Aboriginal groups around the United States, North America, arguably around the world, who then want to jump in and lay claim to their land too? So the Supreme Court didn't listen to the case on the grounds of ownership. All they did was determine whether or not these Shoshones had been paid. And this is so utterly ridiculous because they had not been paid. And what the government did is it took the $27 million and it shifted it from an account run by the Treasury or the Treasury itself into an account owned and run by the Department of the and declared that because that money was then in trust for the Shoshones, that they had in fact been paid. The money hadn't been dispersed. There were Shoshones running around with checks and wads of cash, but the money had been paid. So that ultimately is where the Supreme Court decision came down, is in favor of the idea that this money had been paid on behalf of the Shoshone people. So at this point, the Shoshone case legally was somewhat squashed. The problem with that is that the Shoshones obviously weren't into that idea. So a couple things happened, and both are very significant. One historically in terms of the way that the United States government deals with Native people, and then the other in terms of just a microcosm, the Dan family and what they had to deal with. The Shoshones had been subjected throughout this entire process to a brilliant form of divide and conquer. What happened is that when news came about that this money had been transferred on behalf of the Shoshones, there were a number of Shoshones who came forward and said, well, I'd like my share of the money. And some of those people were coerced and advised to come forward and claim that they wanted some of this money. And others just wanted some of the money. I mean, if you're in a situation, if you're living in Battle Mountain and your income has been poor and beyond poor your entire life, and you hear that on your behalf there is $27 million somewhere, it makes sense in my brain that somebody along the line would be like, okay, that's not a bad deal. We've been fighting this for 100 years. We can't afford lawyers anymore. Our grandfathers' grandfathers fought this fight and lost against the United States government. Let's take a little bit of a payout. At least we can survive for a while. The problem is that there were a number of traditionalists who were saying, our birthright and our land is not for sale. We can't take the money, because once we actually take the money and deposit the checks, this is over. Then what do we stand upon? We have nothing to stand upon. So that was going on, and over the course of the next 20 years, the Dan family endured a number of livestock confiscations that impacted their ability to live and to function. And by livestock confiscations, I literally mean, I can't remember when the first roundup was, but it might have been 92 or 93, I can't remember offhand. But the Bureau of Land Management showed up one morning, early in the morning, with trucks, and huge trucks, and helicopters, and lots of guns. And they showed up at the Dan Ranch in Crescent Valley and started to round up Carrie and Mary's cattle and horses. And they were rounding them up in the open fields, as well as from the ranch itself. And at that time, Carrie and Mary's brother Clifford, an elderly Shoshone man, doused himself in gasoline. And this is all on video. It's VHS footage at this point, and I don't think anyone's transferred it to digital, but someone should. But Clifford Dan doused himself in gasoline and threatened to light himself on fire because he said that he would rather die rather than give up his Aboriginal claim, but B, allow them to steal his livelihood. And he was wrestled to the ground by BLM agents and beaten literally to a bloody pulp. And again, all of this is on video. And he was jailed. And that's when things really kicked in for the Western Shoshone Defense Project. And the Defense Project itself was this ragtag group of punk rockers and people like yourself who came together and went out to Crescent Valley and stood watch for most of the 1990s. There were people in shifts 24 hours a day, monitoring every airplane that flew overhead, monitoring every helicopter that flew overhead, any car that drove in. Middle of the night, it's 1 a.m., and from the highway, lights come in. There was a logbook. It was just like, write it down, to prevent another roundup from happening. Well, as you can imagine, unfortunately, a couple things were going on. One, at the time, gold started to slip. The value of gold started to slip, and I'll talk about gold in a second. So the mining interests around the area, there wasn't as much intensive interest in mining the land, so politically it wasn't as hot of an issue. And also, the government can wait forever. The government's the government. I mean, 2 elderly Shoshone sisters are going to be dead within 30 years. Their supporters are going to get bored and splinter away into new things to focus on. So 1993, 94, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99, these are just 6, 7 years, for the government. It's just like, whatever. They just put, this case through over 60 years in the court system. It's a bat of an eye to the government. The government's a body without age, right? But to the activists who are supporting the Western Shoshone Nation, it's just eternity. I mean, some of these people were out there for years. I mean, years and years and years waiting for another roundup, waiting for something to happen. And, nothing was happening. So eventually people start to splinter away and move away. I mean, some of the folks were out there literally living in the middle of the desert in makeshift structures that they built next to Carrie and Mary Dan's place for years, and it's pretty nuts out there. The mining issue is an entirely different animal, and totally is the underpinning of all this stuff. Because what the government wasn't about, and what the mining companies weren't about, was a bunch of sagebrush. It's not it. Like, there's pinyon trees up in the mountains, and there's sagebrush, and that's not what this is about. It's all about the gold. Because the Ruby Mountains and that area of the Shoshone Mountain Range is rich in microscopic particles of gold. So there were a number of huge mining companies, multinational mining companies, that came in an attempt to mine this gold. And the only way they could do that is by ousting the Shoshones, specifically the Dans, because Carrie and Mary were very vocal about their Aboriginal rights. And these mining companies were using processes of mining this gold which were completely destructive to the land. And this was abhorrent to Carrie and Mary, who wanted to just, again, be caretakers of the land. And they were using cyanide leach mining, they meaning the mining companies, were using cyanide leach mining in order to get at this gold. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with the process, but basically you take a chunk of mountain, you crush it down, you run it through cyanide, and cyanide bonds with gold. So the water that gets produced from that process gets discarded. It's poisonous as hell. And what you do then is you take this cyanide bonded to gold and you process that, and you can extract microscopic particles of gold so that, you know, your multi-tons of raw material might equal 1 speck or 1 ounce or whatever it is. But the problem is, if you've been going up into the mountains to pray for the last 200 years, the mountains are going to go away because there's no way to extract the gold in any way other than the cyanide leach mining because the particles are so minuscule. So now we'll go back to what I referenced much earlier, which was the Treaty of Ruby Valley. You know, and I said that the Treaty of Ruby Valley, you know, gave mining rights up. And people get confused when I say that because they're like, wait a minute, well, then what's the Shoshone's position? They gave away their mining rights in 1863. Why isn't it okay to tear apart Mount Denabo, which is a sacred Shoshone mountain, and all the surrounding mountains? The Shoshones gave that up. Well, the treaty's worded as, it is further agreed by the parties hereto that the Shoshone country may be explored and prospected for gold and silver or other minerals. And when mines are discovered, they may be worked, and mining and agricultural settlements formed, and ranches established whenever they may be required. Mills may be erected, and timber taken for their use, as also for building and other purposes in any part of the country claimed by said bands. Okay, so in 1863, a miner was defined very differently than the way a miner is defined in 2011, or for that matter, 1979 or 1980, okay? A miner in 1863 is a dude with a beard and a pickaxe and a mule, and he's hammering at rock until he dies, and maybe he makes a little pile of gold, and he sells it in whatever nearby city, and he buys booze, rock on. Okay, that was a miner in 1863. A miner was not a multinational mining company with the capacity to destroy an entire mountain and leave the mountain gone forever, and in its place, a pool of cyanide-infected and chemical-infected water that would never, ever again, or at least not for 1,000 years, become drinkable or usable in any capacity. That just simply was not what was happening. It's not the context of what the Shoshone agreed to. So the idea that sacred mountain ranges, and any mountain ranges for that matter, in Shoshone land, which they never gave, ceded or sold or gave away, was being destroyed and turned into a poisonous hell, was completely abhorrent. And I remember in the early 90s sitting next to the Dan Ranch at night, and we were looking out down the valley, down Crescent Valley, and you could see like lights as the mine, of course, is going 24/7, 365, you know, out in the distance. And I remember seeing the lights, and we said, as long as that doesn't get bigger, I mean, God damn it, like this is already a disaster. As long as that mine doesn't get bigger, at least we can fight this. At least we can fight this fight. And then, of course, more gold gets discovered, and then the mines get bigger. And the next year, now the lights cover this entire hill, and it's way more intense. And you know, Mount Denabo, which is, you know, again, you know, arguably the most sacred of the mountains in that stretch of mountains. You know, we were just constantly saying, as long as this doesn't touch Denabo, then, you know, then maybe this is not acceptable, but at least this is a fight we really won. Well, then when they discovered gold at Denabo, and all of a sudden you see the lights start encroaching over time across the valley, and then mining is starting to be done on Denabo as well, you know, it starts to become the situation where you start to feel hopeless, you know, like what is possible to do on behalf of these people? So the case for the Western Shoshone legally ended at the Supreme Court. What Kerry and Mary Dan did, because they kick ass, was they went a different angle. They started to appeal to the United Nations, to human rights factions within the United Nations, against the United States government, saying, listen, these are absolutely human rights violations which are taking place here, and they need to be noted as such and stopped on the grounds of international human rights law, because the United States is not pursuing it on the grounds of Aboriginal rights and land ownership law. So they did that, and I actually wrote a piece on this a while back, and I thought that the best way to hammer through this would be just to read you this piece, because it's pretty interesting stuff, and unfortunately it doesn't have a very happy ending, but I'll read this a bit, and then we can take some questions and talk about some other things too, because I don't want this just to be Craig's talking head for a while. It's just, you know, tedious. On August 23rd, 1999, the Yamba Shoshone tribe submitted a request for urgent action to the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, they're called CERD, under its urgent action and early warning procedure. The Eli Shoshone tribe subsequently joined in this request. CERD was established by the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, a United Nations treaty to which the U.S. is a party, and the purpose of it was to monitor and review actions by states to fulfill their obligations under this convention. So the request asserted that the rights of the Western Shoshone are being violated by the U.S. in a discriminatory fashion on the basis of their status as indigenous people. And the request asked that CERD direct the United States to halt actions threatening irreparable harm to the Western Shoshones and to enter negotiations with Western Shoshone leaders to resolve Western Shoshone land rights issues. Like, that sounds like what needed to happen all along. Like, that sounded like, you know, that had potential. In 2006, the United States was found in violation of human rights of Native Americans and was urged to take immediate action. In a historic and strongly worded decision by the United Nations Committee on by the CERD, the United States was urged to, quote, freeze, quote, desist, and, quote, stop actions being taken or threatened to be taken against the Western Shoshone people of the Western Shoshone Nation. In its decision, CERD stressed the, quote, nature and urgency, end quote, of the Shoshone situation, informing the United States that it goes, quote, well beyond, end quote, the normal reporting process and warrants immediate attention under the CERD urgent action procedure. And those little quotes don't sound like much. That's not like a barrage of people coming down saying, you know, screaming stop. But in terms of diplomacy and in terms of the United Nations and in terms of the way that legalese works, it's a pretty strongly worded document, especially against the United States, who tend to be impenetrable to this stuff because they tend to write the rules that create these bodies and whatnot. So to have the CERD come back and say, stop, freeze, desist, you know, nature and urgency, those sorts of wordings, it was pretty intense. So the monumental action challenges the United States government's assertion that federal ownership of nearly 90% of these Western Shoshone lands is valid. The land base covers approximately 60 million acres, stretching across what is now referred to as the states of Nevada, Idaho, Utah, and California. Some of this might be a little bit of review. Western Shoshone rights to the land, which they continue to use, care for, and occupy today, were recognized by the United States in 1863 by the Treaty of Ruby Valley. The U.S. now claims these same lands as public lands, or federal lands, through an agency process, and that's the ICC, the Indian Claims Commission, and has denied Western Shoshone fair access to U.S. courts through that same process. The land base has been and continues to be used for the United States for military testing, open pit cyanide heap leach gold mining, and nuclear waste disposal planning. And actually, I didn't even touch on some of that stuff. Like, you know, military testing has gone on throughout Nevada for years, and there are certain groups of Shoshone people which have such higher rates of thyroid cancer and other cancers as a result of this. And then the whole thing about nuclear waste disposal planning, like Yucca Mountain, which got shot down a while back, for years and years and years was going to be the repository for nuclear waste from around the United States, and it was going to be trucked through Shoshone territory in very potentially dangerous situations on the back of trucks and on railroads and whatnot that were just, you know, ripe with the potential to be sabotaged or just break down, spreading nuclear waste all over Shoshone territory. But, you know, they're not going to put the nuclear waste, they, meaning the government, are not going to put the nuclear waste you know, just outside of Washington, D.C. That's a bad location. Put it in the middle of the desert. That's a good location because, quote unquote, no one lives out there. You know what I mean? That's kind of the mindset. So, the U.S. has engaged in military style seizures of Shoshone livestock, trespass fines in the millions of dollars, and ongoing armed surveillance of the Western Shoshone who continue to assert their treaty rights. Based on these actions and a dramatic escalation of new actions involving irreparable harm to Western Shoshone and their environment, the Indigenous Law and Policy Program at the University of Arizona, with the support of them, the Western Shoshone filed a renewed legal action at the United Nations CERD. In addition to evidence of the United States conduct, the Western Shoshone delegation delivered over 13,000 signatures from citizens across the USA supporting the Western Shoshone action to the CERD. And the petition was a result of a campaign organized by the rights-based development organization Oxfam America to demonstrate the widespread concern of the Shoshone people to the United Nations. There's just a little bit more. CERD rejected the U.S.'s argument that the situation was not novel, because that was the argument, and therefore should wait until the U.S. submits its periodic report, which was past due at the time this was written, probably 2006, by like 3 years. The committee informed the United States that, quote, although these are indeed long-standing issues, they warrant immediate and effective action and should be dealt with as a matter of priority, end quote. The United States was, quote, urged to pay particular attention to the right to health and cultural rights of the Western Shoshone, which may be infringed upon by activities threatening their environment and or disregarding the spiritual and cultural significance they live to their ancestral lands, end quote. And the CERD presented its decision to the Western Shoshone. The decision detailed the U.S. actions against the Western Shoshone and called upon the United States to immediately do the following things. 1, respect and protect the human rights of the Western Shoshone people. 2, initiate a dialogue with representatives of the Western Shoshone in order to find a solution acceptable to them and which complies with their rights. 3, adopt the following measures until a final decision or settlement is reached on the status, use, and occupation of Western Shoshone's ancestral lands in accordance with due process of law and the U.S. obligations under the Convention. 4 was freeze all efforts to privatize Western Shoshone ancestral lands for transfer to multinational extractive industries and energy developers. Next, desist from all activities planned and or conducted on Western Shoshone ancestral lands. And finally, stop imposing grazing fees, livestock impoundments, hunting, fishing, gathering restrictions, and rescind all notices already made. The decision is historic, and that is the first time a United Nations committee has issued a full decision against the U.S. in respect to its highly controversial federal Indian law and policy. The decision expressed particular concern that the U.S.'s basis for claiming federal title to Shoshone land rests on a theory of gradual encroachment through a compensation process in the Indian Claims Commission. The decision highlights that the same process was found by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights to, quote, violate human rights norms, principles, and standards that govern determination of indigenous property interests, end quote. When the U.S. last appeared before the committee in 2001, committee members expressed alarming concern that the U.S. laws regarding indigenous people continue to be based on the outdated colonial era, quote, doctrine of discovery, end quote. The committee gave the U.S. a July 15, 2006 deadline to provide it with information on the action it had taken, and the United States did not comply. So that brings us up more or less to present day activities. And we talked earlier about gold prices and how gold prices had ebbed for a while. Gold prices are at an extraordinary high. I don't know how many of you buy, trade, sell gold, or watch the news from the trading indices in New York. But what were you going to say?
You can just watch this commercial, like,
yeah.
send your gold in the mail.
Totally. Send your gold in the mail. You see ads outside of hotels all the time. Sell your gold here, totally. Gold's at an all-time high. So those microscopic particles, which were trading ultimately at $200, $300, $400 an ounce years ago, or I don't know what gold's at now, $1,200 an ounce, $1,400 an ounce. Okay, so I don't know what gold was at the last time it was at a high, which I don't remember what it was. I don't know if inflation adjusted, if it's now at an all-time high, or if it's just at a dollar all-time, or a dollar high, you know what I mean? But it's getting close, It's out of control, yeah, it's out of control. So the mining's relentless now. The mining is absolutely relentless. And how do you create a situation now where the Shoshone have a claim? The U.S. government it's crazy. The U.S. government has continued to be obstinate in answering the CERD's claim. And the problem is that Mary Dan, one of the two Shoshone sisters, died a few years ago, unfortunately, in an accident on the Dan Ranch in Nevada. She was riding an ATV, and we think either had a heart attack or rolled the ATV and had a heart attack and died under the ATV, leaving Carrie Dan alone, essentially, in this struggle. Because part of the problem, and I don't mean to sound flippant here, is that Shoshone, the next generations of Shoshone struggle with getting involved. They struggle with learning their traditional language. They don't want to speak the traditional language because that's not what their friends at school are speaking. It's not what people around them are speaking. So what happens? Again, the government can wait. Not 5 years from now if Carrie Dan dies because she's so vocal. What happens 50 years from now when there's no kids to speak Niuwa to each other? Niuwa is the Shoshone called a language. Like when there's no one to speak Niuwa to each other and the kids don't know their language, the Aboriginal land claim is going to mean that much less because the kids won't have a connection to to what it means to be on this land since time immemorial. You know? And again, like, I'm a second-rate interpreter of first-rate ideas, meaning I grew up in Connecticut. Like, I don't have a drop of native blood in me. You know, I'm just literally somebody who's interested in and passionate and joining in solidarity with the Western Shoshone. You know, and I know that, like, you know, my blood boils with this stuff. But you know, what happens if your lifelong involvement has been one of futility almost, because the government is just relentless and the mining is relentless? What do you do other than eventually just either acquiesce or continue to struggle in whatever capacity you can? So these are immense issues, and again, it's that kind of divide and conquer model. You know, the more that you know, pop culture is fed to Shoshone kids, the less they're going to be apt to really want to engage. The less that traditional language and custom is offered to Shoshone kids, you know, the more they're going to want to just, you know, disengage. It's kind of a disaster. So what's cool is that the Western Shoshone Defense Project is reasonably local. I mean, you know, drive west and you get out to the Crescent Valley exit just past Elko, and you can head south and talk to the people there and see what's going on. And I've been out of touch actually for a little while with them, but I actually put some calls into them today to say that, you know, there's students on campus who are interested in maybe finding out more and getting involved. So you can find out, like, you know, up to the minute by talking to representatives of the Defense Project. But that, by and large, is a very generalized, somewhat specific at times, history of what the Western Shoshone have faced out there. So if people have any questions, I mean, I just yammered for about 40 minutes. If people have any questions, I can do my best to answer them. Or if you have ideas and whatnot, even about ancillary, you know, similar issues, I'd love to hear them. Yeah.
Well, I guess I got two things to say then. I wanted to ask, in the arsenic mining, were they using water that was brought in, or were they using, do they have water?
Oh, you rule. My gosh, you just, like, that's a huge chapter that I didn't include, and I can answer it very briefly. You know, so the question is, where's the water coming from for the cyanide heap leach mining, right? And the water was coming from the local water table. So that's the problem, I'm so glad you mentioned that, right? I'm trying to remember 100 million things, and, you know, and that's the huge issue, is that the water is coming from the local water table. So you've got communities that live in an incredibly arid place already, and now the water table is being dropped because they're pumping so much water into the mines and into this heap leach cyanide process. The water table is dropping, and, you know, what are people going to drink? What are people going to survive on? And what do you do with all this water and all this waste that's being held in these I can't remember the proper term for the pits, but they're pits lined with this plastic, you know, and you know, and say? Yeah, it's brutal, right? Because what's crazy is that, like, you know, animals will go and drink from the pits and then die, right? So, you know, but again, the model of approach to this stuff is that not in my backyard. You know, as long as that stuff doesn't end up in Seattle, near where I live, it's cool. No matter if it doesn't end up, you know, in Virginia, where my parents live, it's cool. You know, it's cool if it's in the desert. No one lives there. Tons of people live there. Shoshones have lived there forever. So, so that's the problem. Is that the water is being poisoned. And, you know, again, Mary, and now Carrie, unfortunately, you know, just her position is, you know, that water's, you know, that's a gift. You know, it's a gift from creation itself. You know, you can't poison that. You know, what happens when you poison the water? We're all dead. So, anybody else? Any other questions, comments, anything?
Well, I was just going to ask you if you know anything about the Black Mesa people in Arizona.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
People I know are doing similar actions.
Awesome.
To help them.
Yeah, I mean, I was
in a similar position. I think they're with oil, though.
Coal.
Oh, coal.
Yeah, I was at Black Mesa. It's been forever. I was there in like 1994, so I haven't been there in a very, very, very long time. But I mean, tell us more. What do you know? No, please.
I know. I'm not super.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, yeah. Look up what's going on in Black Mesa. That's a legal tangle of, like, if the Shoshone tangle is immense, Black Mesa tangle is like epic proportion. Like, that's like I don't even know where to begin. I don't even know where to begin to describe it almost. You know, it's just like, that's crazy. It's all about coal. Yeah. So yes.
So Western Shoshone Defense Project is around. There's still people out there watching.
As far as I was last there were no longer. Yeah, that would be Sweet Child of Mine. Yeah, and quite an excellent rendition too. Yeah, it's not bad. I mean, it's not the best rendition. what happened was there were a couple people who were living locally, doing legal work and lobbying and whatnot, but there wasn't anybody left on site because there was almost no reason to be. I mean, the last roundup was, it was within the last 10 years. The thing is not because if you went out there, fresh out of college or in college in 1993, what happens by the year 2000? It's just like, you're just waiting for something to happen, so people filtered away. I mean, literally, people dug holes in the ground and built structures in holes in the ground, and activists were living in those for a while, so, how long could you live in a hole in the ground before you finally start to lose it, so, but there aren't people living out there anymore. I don't know if Carrie needs help around the ranch. She might, but yeah, that's something to ask the Defense Project. But when I hear back with them, I'd be happy to let Chris know, spread the word. And this rendition of this song just turned in Nevada, like, or in the greater. What's the area like? Like the area of the land itself. Okay, so the question was, what's now it's good again. The question was, what's the area of land that we're talking about, basically? And it goes from California, I think over the border into Utah, east-west, and then north into Idaho, certainly, and I can't remember how far south, but all the way through Nevada. So, and there's a map, I think, on WSDP, Western Shoshone Defense Project, WSDP.org. So, yeah. And there's also, in case anybody's interested, I haven't updated the site in forever. I just kind of let it be static because I just wanted it to just be an information receptacle. But if you go to wordsasweapons.com and click on the Shoshone, there's like a lot of detailed information on the Shoshone land rights history there. So I was updating it pretty often and eventually realized that, before people were tracking web traffic and stuff, I was like, okay, I'm just letting it be and just let it exist. So yeah, it hasn't been updated in a while, but it's there if you want the basics. I don't have up to date. The question was about what's the population of what's your Shoshone population are we talking about? And I don't know, but I can definitely look that up and we can trade email addresses together. This is memorable. Yeah, there was a the question was, are there any efforts made to teach Shoshone language to Shoshone kids and get cultural programs going? I don't know what happened. There was a Shoshone Cultural Center that was in Elko started, where kids could go and learn and people could go and learn. And I don't know if it's still open or not. I was there 4, 5, 6 years ago or something, and I just didn't. I'm not sure if it's still open, but we'll easily find out. Question, yeah, come to you.
Do they have any type of representation? People in Washington have meetings, fight for these kind of things, or they just
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Okay, so the question was, do they have representation going to Washington, looking, like lobbying and doing that sort of work? And they do. There's a woman named Julie at the Western Shoshone Defense Project, who I hope is still there. I haven't talked to her in a while. But she was doing legal counsel, and for years and years, Carrie was going to these UN meetings and all sorts of different kinds of meetings, and doing that sort of necessary outreach. Because that, unfortunately, is like, and this is where radical and alternative thinking is really valuable, because that's the game. Right? That's what burns you out. It's like, okay, so let's say you sue me for making fun of a sweet child of mine, and we go to court. We're going to battle that back and forth until one of us is broke, and then the other will win. Well, that might take 2 weeks or 10 years. Or if I'm the rich dude, I'll win. If you're rich, you win. And in the case of the government versus a band of Indians, forget about it. The government just has to bide its time. And, natives will run out of money eventually. So the game is this going to Washington and lobbying and stuff. But given the parameters of the legal situation, it's arguably at times the best that can be done, because it raises awareness and gets people, motivated, to help and be involved and at least spread the word. Even if not about the Shoshone issue, about other indigenous issues, indigenous issues.
So if, say, the government is doing this, who would you have to go to get them to change their mind? Would you have to change their mind, or would you have to get someone above them to change their mind?
Well, that's what Carrie and Mary's move to the CERD people. That was a I don't know the football term. I'm an idiot when it comes to football. But there's a lateral. Is that where you throw sideways and then the dude throws a touchdown and everyone goes crazy and drinks beer? Yeah. So that was the lateral. That was kind of a usurping of the process. They're just like, okay, the Supreme Court, is not working in our favor. We're going to go human rights angle. Kind of brilliant move, So, but the thing is, though, is that what position is then established that has to be responded to, because the government's position could be just like, hey, the Supreme Court said this, human rights. I mean, that's like, that's just wish-wash poetry. You know what I mean? But hopefully it has some validity. I mean, but again, we all know, like, this is all words on paper ultimately. If the UN says you must stop and they don't stop, then it's just words on paper. So that's why having human bodies out there actually probably did some good for a while to prevent, the trucks from coming back and doing roundups and whatnot. But it's just a question of human resources, really. Like, at what point do the human resources completely run out? It's when people get burned. They're just like, I'm living in the desert. This isn't where I'm from. And then some people stayed forever. Like, my friend Chris Sewell got out to the Defense Project, I think, in 1992. And I think he left probably 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago. Yeah. He spent his life out there. It's just unbelievable. Yeah.
I was going to say something. It's not just like the government, like big corporations too, because they deal with like oil fracking, like they do in the ground for natural gas. It ruins people's water, where it lights on fire and stuff. So we're fighting it on two huge edges there. Corporations, they're not really the government. And then the other thing I was going to ask you is, what if the younger generation of Shoshones just decide, their culture and they take the money? Is that just
yeah, and this is a kind of weird thing, because I don't know why I'm drawing a blank on this, so you'll have to forgive me, but I think that there were people who ended up taking payouts of some kind from some like part of this money, because the money has gained interest. We're talking like hundreds of millions of dollars at this point, which is in storage, I can't remember how it came about that some people were able to take, don't quote me on this part of it, in fact, don't quote me on any of it, check your figures, always, but I think that there were some people who ended up with some money from somewhere, and again, that would be easy to do, if I was somebody who wanted to win this thing, I would just find somebody to back me, open a bank account, start writing checks to Shoshone people and say, hey, you cash that check, we win, government, woo, So, that would be, pretty easy to fabricate. So I can't remember, but yeah, the idea all along was that if the Shoshone took the money, then they'd given up their birthright, So, but, so your question is more, what if the younger generations were told not to do that? Yeah.
Just more if they get into it, because it seems like they're losing their culture.
Yeah.
Pop culture and stuff like that. So.
Totally. Yeah, but again, the problem is, it's like, okay, so what is, I don't know what $27 million, because we don't know the population. We've established that we forget that factor figure. Anyone with an iPhone might be able to look it up, but take let's just say $150 million divided by the number of Shoshones. That's an attractive number, right? If you're bummed and broke, and again, I don't mean to harp on Battle Mountain, but Battle Mountain is not Beverly Hills. So if you're living and grew up in Battle Mountain or in the Elko Indian Colony, you're not super stoked in terms of money, or generally. So all of a sudden, you get an offer for your share of $150 million. Like, that's looking kind of promising. And again, if you've disconnected from what that money signifies, which is, part and parcel of genocide.
Kind of going off that, is there like a strong traditionalist movement with the Shoshone, or is that something that's kind of lacking?
There was for many years, for sure. And I don't think the Western Shoshone Defense Project has done a spring gathering for a while, but they used to do this spring gathering where they would, where people would meet every spring on Carrie and Mary's ranch and sing songs and hear prayers and engage in cultural, development, recognition. And, like Shoshone spiritual leaders would come out, and Shoshone folks from all over would come and participate, as would students and other folks, just to learn. And that was going on for a long time. But people get old and die, and I mean, so some of the Shoshone spiritual leaders have passed on, and then, then there's a question of who's going to coordinate this spring gathering and things like that. But there are definitely traditionalists, who are hanging on. I mean, Carrie is one of them, and family is one, and there were others from throughout Nevada for sure. But at this point, I'm not sure who's left. I mean, it's pretty weird to say that. I'm not sure. Question.
Actually, it's not a question. The total population in 2000 was 12,300.
Okay, so 12,300 Shoshones in 2000. Okay, so let's just do some math and say that they've, increased in number, as it were. So 15,000 to 12, I don't know, 13,000 Shoshones. Divide $100 million by that. And I think it's more than that. I think it's probably up to $200 million or something like now. And that becomes it's ominous. Sorry, question up there. Yeah.
You said the deadline given by CERD was in 2006, and there's been no compliance.
I don't think there's been compliance since, and that's another thing to look up because I'm not.
The next step, hearing.
Inevitably endless hearings. Did you have an answer to that?
Yeah, actually, I think the U.S. said something about how they don't recognize it. They don't recognize the UN's policy, and just recently, Obama actually finally said, "Hey, we recognize the UN policies." Blah blah blah.
So he said specifically about the Shoshone case, or
not the Shoshone case, but just the humane, indigenous, that whole policy from the UN. He finally said, "Yeah, we're on board."
Wow. Okay. See, it's weird, right? Like on one hand, you want to jump for joy and just be like, "Oh, that's awesome, right? That rules." And then at the same time, it's like the Shoshones acquired legal counsel, like I said, in 1932. So now we're at what, 70? My math is bad. 80, almost 80 years later. 80 years later, the government's like, yeah, we can identify that we should adhere to legality. It's like, oh my God, what are you talking about here? I mean, okay, so how long does it take to get to a point where where a decision is made and anything is made in the Shoshone's favor? Like 600,000 more years, we'll all be flying spaceships to the lobby meetings in DC and stuff. Crazy. Any other questions and stuff? Yes?
Do you think there's any chance that the Shoshone will get anything resembling justice as long as the United States government and capitalism exists?
It's difficult. It's really difficult to say. I would love to believe so, but I don't understand why the mines would leave. I mean, the mines don't have any reason to leave. They've got a good deal going, I think that the government could easily make a decision in support of the Shoshones. Whether or not the mines are going to bail is a totally different story. The mines have no reason to leave whatsoever. I mean, there's lots of gold to be had, lots of mountains to tear down, and I've often thought that going after the mines would be an awesome first step, rather than playing the government game. Because, like I said, the governments can go on forever. I mean, and companies, they get shut down, and by public opinion, like even by public opinion, why do we value gold? Like, what stupid thing is that? Like, where does that come from in our mindset that gold has value and meaning? It certainly doesn't have meaning in our commerce anymore. It's not like I'm going to go buy a soda with, a dollar gold piece. You know what I mean? It's just not going to happen. So, I'm no different than most of us. I doubt that any of us are wearing gold rings and gold chains tonight. And maybe we are, maybe we're not, whatever. But like, I've never thought that gold was a good thing. You know what I mean? Like, I like pizza more, or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, so like, it sounds dumb, but could we start a process by which gold becomes less desirable? Then all of a sudden the value is going to drop. When gold's at $1,400 an ounce, things are not looking good. And it's all about the money.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the good things to do is always follow the money. So you mentioned obviously there's these corporations. Which corporations are they? Who are the shareholders of these corporations, and how are they individually connected with even just politics in Nevada or policymakers in Washington?
That's a great question, to which I don't have the exact answer for you. That's a great question for sure. It's a great question. Yeah.
So, in your opinion, let's say if a group like the Earth Liberation Front were to go after these mines, because obviously they're endangering not only Native people but also the land around that these people are living on, that they make their livelihood off of, do you think that would be more harmful or beneficial, the Shoshone?
Kerry's position always, no guns, no violence, no exceptions. No guns, no violence, no drugs, no alcohol, no exceptions.
Including towards property.
Including towards property, yeah, including towards property. Like, because, think about it, like I was saying, like there were many, many nights where we would sit in the valley and see lights down at the other end of the valley, and the lights weren't just like people, putting up Christmas trees. The lights at the other end of the valley were mines, stripping the land away. So, stripping the land, stripping the gold away. So, what could be done? Of course, you sit down there and you think, wow, we could run down there and, take a truck and drive it away and, blah, 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 whatever. But, yeah, the Dan's position was unquestionably, no violence against property, no violence against anybody. This was an issue that had to be cleared up by other means. So,
like he was saying, did they ever try to take any action against the mine people, the actual mines?
I'm not sure if they ever actually did or not. Meaning like economic action against the mine.
I was thinking, kind of thinking about this movie. It's called Gas Line.
What's it all about?
It's about like just like I was saying earlier, natural gas and how they do it. They frack it, and like you were saying, it has them cesspools and stuff like that. It has damage, it has water rights on fire. So what they did there was they started writing like the CEOs and stuff, and they wouldn't answer back, and they tried to turn it into the government portion of it. And like finally at the end, they finally got some made a reservation in Pennsylvania because that was like one of the big problems. So I was just wondering if you guys ever tried to do it on that standpoint.
Yeah, and you mean contacting the
We're just going after them and see if anybody's ever tried that.
Yeah, there were. I'm trying to think of who it was. I want to say Great Basin Mine Watch for a while was taking that the more environmental approach of saying like this is what this is doing. This is killing people. And there was other organizations too that were taking that approach. And again, I don't mean to sound pessimistic. I wish I had an answer. This would be awesome if this all had a happy ending. And then we ... and then you did this, and it's over. Let's go eat. But again, the mines, they're in this position where they just have to hold the ground, right? And no pun intended. They literally just have to hold the ground and continue doing what they do, and money is to be made. And especially now, more money than ever is to be made. It's crazy. Yeah.
How about environmentalist organizations like Greenpeace,
Earth First,
like they showed solidarity?
Yeah, over the years they definitely did. In fact, yeah, I know that there's a number of publications that ran articles on Shoshone stuff over the years for sure, and like people were involved, and representatives were showing up at spring gathering and whatnot. Again, part of the problem, and this is, again, not to sound pessimistic, part of the problem is how do you organize? How do you organize people in support of this ongoing multi-decade-long process that is existing by and large at like the governmental, legal, Supreme Court-ish kind of level, how do you organize? It's challenging, but most definitely involvement in different organizations led to a lot of people finding out about the issue, which is a good first step. I'm going to say that kind of sheepishly because I wish that there was a great first step, but a good first step is having people know about it, at least finding out what's updated. I looked on the Western Shoshone Defense Project site recently, and it hadn't been updated. Like the last update was that no major money or something has been dispersed as of 2009, it said something like that. So that's 2 years old. It's 2 years old at this point, so no one's even updated the website. It's like resources get depleted and wiped out aside from energy as well. So. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
When the logging companies were going after the redwoods in Northern California, protesters, pacifists would take chains and chain themselves to trees, chain themselves to tractors. With the Shoshone not like that. We went out and literally tied ourselves, put ourselves in the machines.
In the line of fire, per se. That would be a question for Carrie Dan, and that really would be a question for Carrie Dan, I'm not sure what tactics would be the tactics that she would desire. I mean, there's video of Carrie in the early 70s at these town council meetings screaming her head off, and just so angry and incensed and whatnot. Well, you know, she's nearly 80 now, so I'm not sure what her position would be on people taking action on like that on her behalf. But I mean, it's worth a call, worth a question, or worth an in-person question. Yeah.
Shoshone tribes are failing against the government and trying to persuade them because of that, the treaty they had that's over the land. You know, miners, they're not perfect. They're not clean. It sounds like they're really irresponsible and reckless with their mining. Would there be a way that town can go and find leaks or, you know, places where their water system, because everybody always has an underground water system. And if there's a leak, they could shut down that mine and get them to at least adhere to code that they had. And I'm sure there's something out there that's ruining the environment and making a hazard for the locals. You know?
Yeah, absolutely.
But
I've always
that would be something maybe the approach they could look for if it's banging their head against the government wall. You know, maybe go for the actual company that's making the profit off of them.
right. You know, I've always wondered that.
Yeah, making it then cost to bring up their safety and also their environment. Because when you do that, you've got to have all kinds of regulations and safety in progress. So you can't, affect the earth. And if that's something that they're leaning, they're not doing, then maybe they can go ahead and go against it with that.
One thing I've wondered is, and I used to know this a long, long time ago, but what does it cost to create an ounce of gold? What is it? It doesn't cost $1,400 to create an ounce of gold, right? It costs much less, which is why people create ounces of gold. So I'd be really curious to know at what point it becomes cost prohibitive to create an ounce of gold, which speaks to what you're talking about. And that would probably be an important thing to ascertain. I'm not sure.
I was just going to say that I think the environmental standpoint's the only standpoint we have to stop it. That's what we
Yeah, probably, right? Yeah. Yeah, because people, and like your point was that, the miners probably want clean water for themselves and their kids too, you know what I mean? So, and whether or not, you're from Nevada or you're from North Carolina, you don't want your country poisoned. And it's a kind of interesting angle, right? Like, I'd never thought about this before, that there's probably a whole angle that can be taken about people, especially now that, like, being pro-American is so desirable post 9/11. Like, being pro-American is like the greatest thing you could be. Wouldn't any good American want their land anywhere in their country to not be poisoned? Which could be an angle to appeal to a massive cross-section of people. If that lobbying angle is something that had potential. Is that a raised hand?
Yes.
Okay, I didn't know if it was an injured hand or perhaps an interpretive dance.
Yeah, but again, going back to the sort of shareholders, this is what made Shack so successful. Is it's like, okay, these are shareholders, they're financing these companies that allow for these operations to continue. So what we need to do is get these shareholders to divest from these companies. And so essentially what they went after is they took pictures of Huntington Life Sciences, which was the source for sucking dogs. Took those pictures and showed them out in public and protested the actual financiers of people like their Huntington Life Sciences. That nearly bankrupted them. Obviously, they got hit with the whole lawsuit, and that shut down Shack. But that's essentially, I think, the type of campaign that would probably be most successful is who funds and finances these gold companies, and what does it take to get them to stop doing it?
Yeah, I think
other than obviously just full-on revolutionary in the U.S. and getting rid of capitalism.
I think that probably one critical thing to do, and again, my history of Western Shoshone and Western Shoshone history has brought us up to 2006-ish, 7-ish, 8-ish, around there. We need to find out what's going on, present day, and I can only imagine that not much has changed, but finding out what's going on first and foremost, we're getting fully updated up to the minute. I was really unnerved to find that the Defense Project site hadn't been updated. That's really kind of upsetting in a way, you know what I mean? Because sure, I don't, I have this group 100 for Haiti, and sometimes the website will go a couple of weeks without getting updated, but that's because I'm whatever, doing something else, or I'm out of town, but it's not like I have crew people. But you'd think the Defense Project would be able to at least update the website, it's like in it, so, yeah.
It's a small population, 12,000.
Yep.
You can never get, even if the most new guy, you can never get a good sense of government or anything there for that population.
Yeah.
So they really have a lot of people behind them.
Very true. Yeah, and there's just not a huge population of people who would immediately necessarily care, right? You know, like, to draw from. Any other questions?
It's a sad issue.
What say?
It's like it's a sad issue.
Yeah, it's a sad issue, and it's one that's, you know, played itself out over the course of over the course of history, time and time and time again. You know, and I mean, even if nothing happens on behalf of the Western Shoshone, just the Western Shoshone conflict and struggle has always been one for me that just inspires me to want to learn more about other. Like you mentioned, Black Mesa. Like I can't even imagine like what the legal documentation about Black Mesa is at this point and all the angles there.
I know for a while it was illegal for them to make any repairs to their houses whatsoever. Otherwise, they were at threat of being kicked off the land. So they had to live, you know, in these basically shacks.
Yeah.
They couldn't improve anything.
Crazy.
Do they not have any reservation land at all?
The Shoshones, some of the Shoshones live on reservation land, but the Dans themselves never were reservation, as they call themselves, reservation Indians. They just never did. There are areas where there are Shoshones living on reservations, you know, but you know, that's a sad state of affairs too. You know what I mean? Like that's just like, you know, imprisonment in a way without bars. So it's a tough call.
I don't know much about reservations because it isn't kind of like the government can't come in and do anything about Maryland and what's in reservations.
You know, I don't know what the exact sovereignty law is, you know, but I would assume that the government can come in. I don't know at what point they can or can't. You know, that's actually a really good question.
So as you put it, they were the laws.
Yeah, they wrote the law. I mean, right, it doesn't matter.
It's just the Bureau of Indian Affairs that takes care of that, which is also a federal.
Okay. Yeah. So, you know, I wish that I had ideas. I wish that I had ideas for action and that sort of thing. You know, I mean, other than the first thing to do, if you're interested in finding out more, check the website. Call. You know, there's a phone number on there. Call them. You know, I called actually today just to say, hey, speaking to some students tonight. Thought it might be cool to figure out what's going on and like, you know, ideas that, you know, how people can get involved and whatnot. And the answering machine was full. Never a good sign. So. You know, but like, you know, trying to find out what the most up-to-date information is would be a great idea, starting there. Or finding, you know, other, you know, if this inspires you to think about other causes, you know, to get involved with those, you know, I mean, don't stop with just Shoshones, not to discount the Shoshones, but yeah.
What's the name of the website?
WSDP.org. Actually, I always used to give the wrong one. I'd say it was .com and then it was .org and then I'd say .org and it was .com. And I think it's WSDP.org. That would make sense. Yeah, so, yeah, WSDP.org. And there's a map right on there to answer your question. The first thing you see is this map. Oh, somebody needs to sign in at some point or whatever. But anyway, so there's a map on there, or there was, and now it's gone. The rest of the internet.
Another question, does the federal government also, they have, I mean, they should include them in the census?
Yeah, I would think they are included in the census. That's a good question.
2005 census.
Yeah, right? Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I would assume they'd be included. I don't know how many or who
But
would
I wonder if
participate.
they would identify themselves as Shoshone or...
Yep. Yeah, I don't know what the stipulation is. How do you self-identify in the census? Like, I mean, I don't know if there's an option for Shoshone. You know? I'm not sure. Huh. Anyway, yeah, I'm not sure. Any other questions, statements, comments, ideas unrelated to Shoshone stuff?
I just think it's the Federal Reserve.
What did you say?
I just think it's the Federal Reserve.
The Federal Reserve?
Ruling the world.
Did you say ruling in the world?
Yeah, we're going to try to rule the world.
Right.
Rule the world.
Right.
I don't think that's the case.
Yeah, I just have to ask how. Actually, in fact, it even seems that it's the exact opposite, because the Federal Reserve is based on fiat and international fiat currency, which is explicitly not based on gold. So if it was the Federal Reserve, then they would want the gold standard.
Okay, that's what
Yeah,
I was
like
just gonna start with gold.
what they do doesn't have anything to do with gold. In fact, most of the critics of the Federal Reserve say that we should go back to gold, which would almost certainly exacerbate the problem of the Western Shoshone,
Yeah.
because they would need gold instead of paper.
What a strange concept of paper.
strange concept, gold.
Yeah.
Well, it's not corrosive.
Why are you looking at me?
Because you know more about it.
You stole your gold chains. I mean,
You
you
think
should-
about it.
Yeah.
Like it's
Minor reincarnating.
conductive, I know that they use it on a lot of machinery.
And you know what? Your point is probably a good one, meaning I was probably short-sighted when I said, you know, I don't have gold rings, we don't have gold rings. Rings might be some small percentage of how gold is used. Gold, by and large, might be used in industry and in electronics far more. That might be the main market. I just don't think about that, right? Like, you know, I just, consume my computer and never think about what goes into it kind of thing, you know? Not that I don't, but I mean,
Well, yeah.
within reason, you know, it's just like plastic, that case came from somewhere and it wasn't an environmentally good thing. I can safely say that drink has been spilled more times than any drink in history. I've got a record being established here. Anybody else? If not, we should all hang out and talk. Sure. I have to say, I admire your heavy metal shop. Woody, very nice.
Let's give Greg a hand.
Like I said before, everybody, one last thing was double check facts and stuff like that, because you know things change. I remember things differently. You know, double check anything that if something stood out and it's the thing that you remember, then double check it and make sure for yourself. It's pretty important. But thanks for listening.
Yeah.